Hey there, and welcome to Dark Creaky TV. If you're new, hit that subscribe button for spine-tingling Reddit creepypasta stories that are perfect for a night of chilling thrills. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and let's get into tonight's stories. I found Zozo on the Ouija board. It's real. So I've been sitting on this for a while, debating whether or not I should share it. A part of me thinks that no one's going to believe it anyway, but another part of me feels like I need to get it out there. Maybe someone else has experienced something similar, and if that's the case, I'd love to hear from you. But before I get into the real meat of the story, let me just start at the beginning. It all started a few months ago. My friends and I have always had a thing for spooky stuff. We'd binge watch horror movies, check out haunted places in our town, and even dabbled in ghost hunting a few times. I wouldn't say we took it all too seriously though. It was more for the adrenaline rush, you know? Something about getting that creepy vibe and laughing it off afterward was just our way of having fun. But then one night, after a few drinks, one of my buddies, let's call him Jake, brought up the idea of trying out a Ouija board. He'd found this old, beat-up one at a garage sale earlier that day and thought it would be hilarious to give it a go. I'd never used one before, and honestly, I didn't really buy into the whole talking to spirits thing. I always figured it was just people moving the planchette without realizing it. Still, after a couple of beers, everything sounds like a good idea, right? So, there we were. 5 of us huddled around this ancient-looking Ouija board in Jake's dimly lit living room. The board was the real deal too. Not one of those cheesy glow-in-the-dark ones you can buy at Walmart. It was made of wood, with the letters and numbers etched in, and the planchette looked like it had seen better days. It added to the whole creepy vibe, but we were all in good spirits, cracking jokes and daring each other to ask stupid questions. "Who wants to go first?" Jake asked, a mischievous grin on his face. Naturally, everyone turned to me. I guess I'd earned the reputation of being the skeptic of the group, so it made sense that I'd be the one to kick things off. With a shrug, I placed my fingers lightly on the planchette, feeling a weird sense of anticipation. The others followed suit, and for a moment, we all just stared at the board, waiting for something to happen. "Are there any spirits here who want to talk to us?" I asked, trying to sound as serious as possible, but my voice still had that playful edge to it. For a few seconds, nothing happened. We exchanged nervous glances, half expecting someone to start laughing and push the planchette to yes, just to mess with the rest of us. But then, slowly, it began to move. At first, I thought one of the guys was doing it, but when I looked around, everyone had the same confused and slightly freaked out expression. The planchette hovered over the yes for what felt like an eternity before finally settling there. "Okay, that's weird," Jake muttered, his bravado from earlier slipping just a bit. We all laughed it off though. It had to be someone in the group messing around, right? I decided to keep going, curiosity getting the better of me. "What's your name?" I asked, figuring I'd catch someone in the act of pushing it this time. The planchette began to move again, this time with more confidence. It slid over the letters, spelling out Zozo. None of us had ever heard that name before, but the mood in the room shifted instantly. It was like the air got thicker, harder to breathe. We all looked at each other, silently questioning if we should keep going. "Who's Zozo?" Emily, one of the quieter ones in the group, finally spoke up. The planchette didn't move, and for a moment I was relieved. Maybe whoever was doing it decided to give it a rest, but then, as if on cue, it slid back to yes. Now, here's where things started getting really weird. Jake, who'd been the one most excited about using the board, suddenly looked pale. He cleared his throat and asked, "Zozo, what do you want?" This time, the planchette spelled out a single word, "You." I'm not gonna lie, that one word sent a chill down my spine. I wanted to laugh it off, tell everyone it was just a joke, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, really off. We decided to call it a night after that. Emily was pretty shaken up. and the rest of us weren't exactly eager to keep chatting with whatever or whoever Zozo was. Jake packed up the board and we all went our separate ways, agreeing to just forget about the whole thing. But that was easier said than done, because that's when the dreams started. At first, they were just little things, random images, vague feelings of unease, nothing I couldn't shake off when I woke up. But they got worse, much worse. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, with the name Zozo echoing in my head, like a bad song I couldn't get rid of. And I wasn't the only one. Jake called me up a few days later, asking if I'd had any weird dreams lately. When I told him I had, he just muttered something about needing to get rid of the board, but it was already too late. Whatever we'd contacted that night, it wasn't just some harmless spirit. It felt like we'd opened a door to something that wasn't supposed to be let in. And now, it wasn't going to leave us alone. If you think this sounds like a bad horror movie, believe me, I wish it was. But this is just the beginning. I'll post more soon, but for now, I need to get some sleep, if I can. The nightmares are getting worse, and I can't shake the feeling that something's watching me. If anyone knows anything about Zozo, or has had a similar experience, I'd really appreciate any advice, because right now, I'm starting to think we've messed with something we can't handle. After that night with the Ouija board, things went downhill fast. I figured the dreams would pass, like maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me after that creepy experience. But no, they didn't go away. They got worse, like some dark cloud slowly closing in on me. It wasn't just the nightmares either. Strange things started happening around my apartment. At first, it was little stuff. Lights flickering, doors creaking open when I knew I'd closed them. That sort of thing. I didn't think much of it. I mean, who hasn't had a light flicker or a door move on its own? Old buildings do that, right? But then it started getting personal. It was a few days after the Ouija board incident when I first noticed the shadow. It wasn't like a regular shadow, the kind you see when a car passes by your window, or when the wind shifts the curtains. No, this was different. I'd be sitting in my living room, scrolling through my phone or watching TV, and out of the corner of my eye, I'd see something dark, like a smudge on the wall. But it wasn't just on the wall. It was there, lurking in the corners of the room, just outside my line of sight. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. You know how it is when you're tired and you start seeing things that aren't really there. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more I noticed it. It wasn't just in my living room either. I'd see it in the hallway, the bathroom, even my bedroom. This dark, shifting shadow that seemed to follow me wherever I went. I didn't mention it to anyone. I didn't want to seem paranoid, and honestly, I wasn't sure if it was real or if my mind was just freaking me out. But then something happened that I couldn't explain away. It was around midnight, and I'd just gotten home from work. I was exhausted, ready to crash, but as I walked into my bedroom, I felt this cold, creeping dread wash over me. The room was dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside my window. As I stepped in, I saw it again. This shadow, more distinct now, like it was solidifying. It was in the corner, near my closet, just standing there, watching. My breath caught in my throat, and for a second I couldn't move. I felt like I was pinned in place, like something was holding me there, forcing me to look at it. And then, just as quickly as it appeared, it vanished. I stood there in the dark for what felt like forever, trying to convince myself that I'd imagined the whole thing. But deep down, I knew I hadn't. Whatever it was real. After that night, the atmosphere in my apartment changed. It felt heavier, like the air was thick with something I couldn't see, but could definitely feel. I started avoiding certain parts of my apartment. The hallway, the bathroom, the corner of my bedroom where I'd seen the shadow. I'd leave lights on all the time, trying to keep the dark at bay, but it didn't help. The shadow, whatever it was, seemed to thrive in the darkness, like it was waiting for me to let my guard down. Then, the voices started. At first, I thought it was just the neighbours, or maybe the TV I'd left on. But no, these voices were different. They were whispers, just barely audible, like they were coming from somewhere deep inside the walls. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the tone was unmistakable. It was like they were taunting me, mocking me, daring me to try and figure out what they were saying. I started sleeping with the TV on, just to drown out the whispers, but even that didn't help. They found their way into my dreams, twisting them into nightmares so vivid I'd wake up gasping for air, convinced that the shadow was right there, hovering over me, watching. By now, I was a wreck. I wasn't sleeping, I wasn't eating, and the constant feeling of being watched was driving me insane. I started avoiding my friends, too embarrassed to tell them what was happening, afraid they'd think I was losing it. But the truth was, I didn't know how to explain what was going on. How do you tell someone that you think a shadow is following you around, or that you're hearing whispers that no one else can hear? But then Jake called me. He sounded off, his voice shaky in a way I'd never heard before. He asked me if I'd noticed anything strange since that night with the Ouija board. When I told him about the shadow and the whispers, there was this long silence on the other end of the line. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "I think it's Zozo." My heart sank. I wanted to laugh, to tell him he was being ridiculous, but the fear in his voice stopped me. Jake wasn't the type to scare easily. If he was spooked, then something was seriously wrong. He told me he'd been seeing things too, dark shapes moving in the corners of his vision, doors opening and closing by themselves, things being moved around when he wasn't looking. He'd even heard the whispers, just like I had. But the worst part, he said, was the feeling that whatever this was, it was getting stronger. He didn't know what to do, and neither did I. All I knew was that it felt like we'd unleashed something that night, something that wasn't going to let us go easily. I tried to brush it off, to tell myself it was just a coincidence, that we were both just freaked out from the Ouija board. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just in our heads. Whatever we'd contacted that night, it was real, and it wasn't going away. Things were about to get much worse. I could feel it in my bones, in the way the shadows seemed to lengthen every time I turned my back, in the whispers that followed me, even when I wasn't alone. Whatever Zozo was, it wasn't done with us yet. After that call with Jake, I couldn't shake the feeling that things were spiraling out of control. It wasn't just a nagging sense of dread anymore. It was like living under a dark cloud that only grew heavier with each passing day. Even in broad daylight, I couldn't escape the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for the right moment to, I don't even know, but it was there, hanging over me like a curse. About a week after Jake and I talked, I finally broke down and told my friend Emily what was going on. I hadn't planned to. Actually, I'd been avoiding her calls, figuring she'd just tell me to snap out of it. But she showed up at my apartment one night unannounced, concerned because I'd been so distant. She took one look at me and knew something was wrong. I must have looked like hell, bags under my eyes, pale, jittery. I hadn't been sleeping, and the stress was eating me alive. "Okay, spill it," she said, sitting down on my couch, refusing to leave until I talked. I didn't have the energy to argue, so I told her everything. The shadow, the whispers, the creeping sense that something was always just out of sight. I even told her about Zozo. Emily listened without interrupting, her expression growing more serious the longer I talked. When I finally finished, she didn't laugh or tell me I was being ridiculous. Instead, she asked, "Have you looked up Zozo?" I hadn't. I'd been too freaked out, too afraid of what I might find. But Emily wasn't about to let it go. She pulled out her phone, typing furiously, and after a few minutes she looked up at me with wide eyes. "Zozo's a demon," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "People say it comes through Ouija boards, and once it's attached to you, it doesn't leave." I felt like the floor dropped out from under me. A demon? That sounded like something out of a bad horror movie, not real life. But the more Emily read, the more it all started to make a twisted kind of sense. The shadow, the whispers, the feeling of being watched, it all fit the descriptions she found online. People who'd encountered Zozo reported similar experiences, and it never ended well. Some claimed they'd been tormented for years, driven to the brink of insanity by this thing that seemed to feed on fear and despair. Others weren't around to tell their stories. Emily looked up at me, her face pale. "We need to get help," she said. "This isn't something we can handle on our own. But who do you go to for something like this? A priest? A psychic? The police sure as hell weren't going to take us seriously." I felt completely out of my depth, like I was drowning in a sea of dark, twisted energy that I couldn't understand, let alone fight. That night, Emily insisted on staying over. I think she was more scared to leave me alone than anything else. We tried to distract ourselves with a movie, but neither of us could focus. The silence between us was heavy, filled with all the things we weren't saying out loud. Eventually, we both crashed on the couch, too exhausted to stay awake any longer. But sleep was a cruel joke. The moment I closed my eyes, the dreams started again. Only this time, they weren't dreams. They were more like memories, except they weren't mine. I saw flashes of faces, twisted, terrified faces, people I didn't recognize but felt an eerie connection to. They were all trapped, screaming silently, like they were locked in some hellish prison with no way out. And then, in the middle of it all, I saw Zozo. It was a shape, a dark, shifting mass that seemed to consume everything around it. But it had eyes, cold, pitiless eyes that bore into me, promising pain, suffering, and something worse. I woke up with a start, my heart racing, Emily shaking me awake. "You were screaming," she said, her voice trembling. "I tried waking you up, but you wouldn't stop." I didn't remember screaming, but my throat was raw, like I'd been doing it for hours. The room was freezing, colder than it should have been. Even with the AC on, I could see my breath in the air, and the shadow in the corner of the room was darker, more solid than before. It was like it was growing, feeding off our fear. Emily was in full panic mode by this point, her tough exterior cracking under the weight of whatever was happening in my apartment. "We need to get out of here," she said, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward the door. "Now!" But as we made our way down the hall, the temperature dropped even further. It was like walking through a freezer, and the shadows stretched out, reaching for us. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening, though I still couldn't understand what they were saying. It felt like they were crawling inside my skull, twisting my thoughts, making it impossible to think straight. We reached the front door, but when I tried to open it, the handle wouldn't budge. It was like something was holding it shut from the other side. Emily was pounding on the door, screaming for help, but her voice sounded distant, like we were trapped in some kind of bubble, cut off from the rest of the world. Then, everything went silent. The whispers stopped, the shadows froze, and the cold was replaced by an oppressive heat that made it hard to breathe. I turned to Emily, but she was staring at something behind me, her face twisted in horror. Slowly, I turned around, and there, in the middle of my living room, was the planchette from the Ouija board. It was just sitting there on the floor, pointing directly at me, even though I hadn't seen it since Jake packed the board away. I didn't know what to do, didn't know how to stop whatever was happening. But in that moment, I knew one thing for sure. Zozo wasn't just a name, a story someone made up to scare people. It was real, and it wasn't going to let us go without a fight. Emily grabbed my hand, pulling me away from the planchette, and together we bolted out of the apartment. This time, the door flew open easily, almost as if it was letting us go, knowing we had nowhere to run. As we sped off in Emily's car, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were just delaying the inevitable. Whatever this was, it was far from over. We didn't know where to go after fleeing my apartment. Driving aimlessly through the empty streets, the tension between Emily and me was palpable. We were both too scared to talk, as if saying anything out loud might give whatever was hunting us more power. The silence in the car was thick, broken only by the occasional rattle of something in the trunk or the distant hum of the engine. Every shadow we passed seemed to stretch out longer, darker, like they were following us. After what felt like hours, Emily suggested we go to Jake's place. Maybe if we all stuck together, we could figure out what to do. I was hesitant at first. Something about the idea of gathering in one place didn't sit right with me. But I couldn't think of a better option, and frankly, I didn't want to be alone again. Not after what happened. When we got to Jake's, his apartment looked different. It was the same place I'd been 100 times before, but something about it felt off, like it wasn't entirely real. The lights inside were dimmer than they should have been, casting strange, distorted shadows on the walls. My stomach twisted with unease as Emily and I walked up to his door, the night air cold and still around us. Jake answered on the first knock, and I could see the relief in his eyes when he saw us. But that relief was mixed with something else, fear, deep and raw, etched into his face. He didn't say anything at first, just stepped aside to let us in. The silence in his apartment was oppressive, almost suffocating. As soon as we were inside, Jake bolted the door behind us, as if that could keep out whatever we were dealing with. I noticed right away that he had his curtains drawn, his windows covered with whatever he could find. Blankets, towels, even a bedsheet. It was like he was trying to block out the world, to hide from something he couldn't see, but knew was out there. "I've been seeing it too," Jake finally said, his voice low and shaky. "The shadow, the whispers. It's all here, man. And it's getting worse." We sat down in his living room, the three of us crowded together on his worn-out couch, like kids at a sleepover scared of the dark. But this was no ordinary fear, and it wasn't something that would go away with the morning light. Emily, who had always been the calm one, was on edge, her eyes darting around the room as if expecting the shadows to move at any moment. "We need to figure out what it wants," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We can't just keep running." Jake nodded, but the look on his face told me he was just as lost as I was. What did it want? Was it trying to scare us? To break us down until we were nothing but terrified shells? Or was it leading us somewhere, like a predator playing with its prey before the final kill? "I looked up ways to get rid of it," Jake said after a long pause. "There's this ritual. It's supposed to banish spirits or demons or whatever, but it's risky." My heart sank. A ritual? This was getting more and more out of control, but we were desperate. We had to do something. Emily was the first to agree. "If there's even a chance it could work, we have to try." Jake nodded and went to grab his laptop, pulling up the ritual he'd found online. As he read through the steps, I couldn't help but notice the growing darkness in the room. It was like the shadows were closing in, drawn to the very idea of what we were about to do. The air felt thick, charged with a tension that made my skin crawl. The ritual was simple enough, on paper at least. We needed candles, salt, something personal from each of us, and the Ouija board. When Jake mentioned the board, my blood ran cold. It was still in my apartment, back in that dark corner where it had reappeared. The thought of going back there made me sick with fear, but I didn't see any other option. "I'll go get it," I said, my voice shaking despite my attempt to sound brave. Emily and Jake exchanged worried looks, but didn't argue. They knew we needed the board if we had any hope of ending this. The drive back to my apartment felt like a death march. Every nerve in my body was on high alert, and the shadows seemed to stretch and warp as we passed under the streetlights. When we pulled up to my building, the entire place seemed darker than before, like it had absorbed the fear we'd left behind. I didn't want to go in, but I had to. Emily and Jake stayed outside, not wanting to risk whatever might be lurking in the apartment. The silence of the building pressed in on me as I made my way up the stairs, each creak of the floorboards echoing ominously. When I reached my door, I hesitated. The air around me felt wrong, like stepping into a room where something terrible had just happened. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. Inside, everything was exactly as I'd left it, except for one thing. The planchette was no longer on the floor. It was back on the table, on top of the board, as if it had been waiting for me. The sight of it made my skin crawl, but I forced myself to grab it, shoving the board and planchette into a bag. The shadows in the apartment seemed to close in on me as I left, the whispers starting again, louder this time, more insistent. I bolted out of there, not daring to look back. Back at Jake's, we set up for the ritual. The candles flickered uneasily, the flames casting strange, shifting shapes on the walls. We drew a circle of salt, each of us placing something personal inside it. I put down my watch, something I always wore, a gift from my grandfather. Emily placed a bracelet her mum had given her, and Jake dropped in his wallet, the leather worn from years of use. As we sat around the board, the air grew colder, the shadows lengthening around us. Jake started reading the words from the ritual, his voice shaking but determined. The candles flickered wildly, the flames dancing as if caught in a gust of wind, though the air was still. Then the whispers began again, louder than ever, filling the room with their sinister murmur. The shadows in the corners started to move, shifting and swirling like a dark tide. I could feel something pressing in on us, something ancient and malevolent, feeding off our fear. The planchette started to move on its own, slowly at first, then faster, sliding across the board with an unnatural speed. None of us were touching it. We all just watched in horror as it spelled out the same word over and over again. Zozo. Jake's voice faltered, the words of the ritual stumbling from his lips as the pressure in the room mounted. The shadows were closing in, the air growing thick and heavy. It felt like the room was shrinking, like the darkness was pressing down on us from all sides. Then, with a sudden, violent force, the candles blew out, plunging the room into total darkness. The whispers stopped, replaced by a heavy silence that screamed louder than any sound I'd ever heard. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, and I jerked away, scrambling to my feet. But there was nothing there, just the darkness, thick and suffocating. Emily was crying, Jake was cursing under his breath, and I could feel the panic rising in all of us. The shadows were everywhere, shifting and writhing like they were alive, and in the center of it all, the board sat, the planchette still spinning wildly across its surface, spelling out that cursed name. And then, just as suddenly as it began, everything stopped. The shadows receded, the air grew lighter, and the room returned to normal. The candles flickered back to life on their own, their flames steady and calm. The planchette lay still on the board, and the oppressive weight that had filled the room lifted, leaving us all gasping for breath. But it wasn't over. I could feel it deep in my bones. Whatever we tried to banish hadn't left. If anything, it was stronger now, more connected to us than ever before. We sat there in stunned silence, the reality of our situation sinking in. Zozo wasn't gone. We'd only made things worse. After the failed ritual, a heavy silence hung over us. We didn't say much. What was there to say? We all knew, without a doubt, that whatever we tried to do had only backfired. The air was thick with dread, like we were waiting for the other shoe to drop. And deep down, I think we all knew that it was only a matter of time. We decided to stay at Jake's that night. None of us wanted to be alone, and the idea of going back to my apartment was out of the question. We huddled together in his living room, trying to convince ourselves that maybe, just maybe, things would be better in the morning. But the night was far from over. It was around 3 a.m. when things started to go wrong. I was lying on the couch, unable to sleep, my mind racing with thoughts of what we'd done. Emily and Jake were both on the floor, wrapped in blankets, but I could tell they were awake too. None of us were really sleeping. Suddenly, there was a loud bang from the hallway, like something heavy had been thrown against the wall. We all sat up, our hearts pounding in unison. The sound came again, louder this time, followed by a series of rapid, heavy footsteps. It sounded like someone or something was running up and down the hallway, crashing into the walls with a terrifying force. Jake grabbed a flashlight, his hands trembling as he flicked it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the empty hallway. But the noises continued, growing louder, more frenzied. It was like whatever was out there was trying to break in, to get to us. Then, without warning, the lights in the apartment flickered and went out, plunging us into complete darkness. The only light came from Jake's flashlight, its beam shaking as he tried to steady his hand. The temperature dropped suddenly, the air turning icy cold, and I could see my breath misting in front of me. The whispers returned, louder than ever, filling the room with their sinister murmur. This time, they were clearer, more distinct, and I could almost make out the words. But they were in a language I didn't understand. Guttural, ancient, and full of malice. The shadows came next, spilling into the room from every corner, twisting and writhing like living things. They crept along the walls, the floor, the ceiling, moving with a purpose, closing in on us. My heart was pounding so hard, it felt like it might burst out of my chest. Emily was clutching Jake's arm, her eyes wide with terror, and Jake was muttering something under his breath, his voice trembling. I knew, in that moment, that we were trapped. There was no running, no escaping what was coming. The shadows circled us, tightening their grip, the whispers growing louder, filling my head with a deafening roar. I felt a pressure in my skull, like something was trying to force its way inside, to take over. And then I saw it. Zozo. It was more than just a shadow this time. It had a shape, a form, a twisted, nightmarish figure that seemed to shift and change every time I blinked. Its eyes were pits of darkness, endless and consuming, and they locked onto mine, freezing me in place. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't do anything but stare into those eyes. They were pulling me in, dragging me down into a void, and I felt myself slipping away, losing my grip on reality. The whispers became a single voice, deep and resonant, speaking directly into my mind. "You are mine." The words echoed inside my head, reverberating through every fibre of my being. I could feel the truth of it, the inevitability of it. Zozo wasn't just some spirit we'd conjured up for fun. It was something ancient, something evil, and it had marked us from the moment we made contact. Jake's voice cut through the fog in my mind, snapping me back to the present. He was shouting, his words desperate and frantic, but I couldn't make out what he was saying. All I knew was that the shadows were closing in, Zozo's presence growing stronger, more oppressive. Then, the pressure in my skull became unbearable, a searing pain that shot through my head like a spike. I fell to my knees, clutching my head, the darkness pressing in on all sides. I could feel something tearing at me, trying to rip me apart from the inside. And just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, everything stopped. The whispers fell silent, the shadows receded, and the pain in my head vanished, leaving only a dull ache. I was lying on the floor, drenched in sweat, gasping for air. The apartment was still, the silence deafening, and for a moment I thought maybe it was over. But then I saw Jake. He was standing in the middle of the room, his face twisted in a grimace of pain and fear. His eyes were wide, unblinking, staring straight ahead at something only he could see. Emily was beside him, shaking him, trying to get a response, but he didn't move. "Jake!" I shouted, struggling to my feet. But he didn't react. And then, in one horrifying fluid motion, his head snapped to the side, and he looked at me. But it wasn't Jake. It was Zozo, wearing Jake's face like a mask. His eyes were black, empty voids, and his mouth twisted into a grin that sent a chill down my spine. He spoke, but it wasn't Jake's voice that came out. It was that same deep, resonant voice that had spoken in my mind, the voice of Zozo. "You cannot escape!" Emily screamed, backing away, but there was nowhere to go. The shadows were creeping back in, filling the room with their darkness. I wanted to run, to get away, but my feet were rooted to the spot, my body paralyzed by fear. Zozo, in Jake's body, took a step toward me, and I could feel the air growing heavier, the oppressive presence of something ancient and evil pressing down on me. I tried to fight it, to push back, but it was like trying to hold back the tide. Then, without warning, Zozo, collapsed to the floor, the darkness lifting as quickly as it had descended. The shadows retreated, the whispers ceased, and the room was plunged into an eerie silence. Emily rushed to Jake's side, shaking him, calling his name, but there was no response. He was breathing, but his eyes were closed, his face slack, like he was in a deep, unnatural sleep. We sat there in the dark, the reality of what had happened sinking in. Zozo was gone, for now, but it had left its mark. Jake was alive, but he wasn't the same. There was a hollowness in him, like a part of him had been ripped away and taken with it, and I knew, deep down, that this wasn't the end. We hadn't escaped. Zozo was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to return. We'd opened a door that night, and now it was wide open, letting something dark and ancient into our lives. I don't know how much time passed before Emily and I finally got Jake into his bed, his breathing shallow but steady. We didn't talk about what had happened, didn't make any plans. There was nothing left to say. I wish I could tell you that we found a way to stop it, that we figured out how to close the door we'd opened. But the truth is, we didn't. And I don't think we ever will, because some doors, once opened, can never be closed. I ordered a mystery box of the deep web. I received an Ouija board with my sister's doll. I've always been the kind of person who loves a good thrill, horror movies, haunted houses, you name it, I'm there. But there's one thing that I never really dabbled in, the deep web. Sure, I'd heard all the horror stories, people getting doxxed, scammed, or worse. But curiosity got the best of me one night after a few drinks with some friends. We'd been talking about urban legends and internet mysteries when someone brought up deep web mystery boxes. You know, those sketchy packages people order that are supposed to contain weird, creepy stuff. Of course, we all laughed it off, but after everyone left, I couldn't stop thinking about it. It was like a nagging itch I just had to scratch. So, naturally, I did the dumbest thing imaginable. I opened my laptop, fired up Tor, and started digging. I'm not going to lie, I was terrified the whole time, but also excited. There's something about the deep web that makes you feel like you're tiptoeing into forbidden territory, a place where you really shouldn't be. But I ignored the voice in the back of my head telling me to stop. I found a site that sold mystery boxes. The layout was bare bones, just text on a black background. It had a list of box options ranging from mildly disturbing to psychologically scarring, and like an idiot, I chose one somewhere in the middle, just eerie enough to satisfy my curiosity, but not so intense that I'd lose sleep over it. I didn't want to go too far, just far enough. A few days later, I got a notification that my box had shipped. No tracking number, no estimated delivery date, just a cryptic message saying, "It's on its way." And that's when the anxiety set in. I started second-guessing my decision. What if something really messed up was in that box? What if it had something illegal in it? But it was too late to back out now. The box arrived 2 weeks later, late at night. It was left on my porch. No return address, no markings, just a plain cardboard box taped up in a hurry. I hesitated before bringing it inside. My heart was pounding as I cut through the tape with a kitchen knife. Inside, there was a bunch of crumpled up newspaper, like someone was trying to pad the contents. I pulled the paper away, half expecting to find something horrific, but what I found was just weird. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It wasn't terrible, but it was strange, like an old attic that hadn't been aired out in years. Underneath the paper, there was an old wooden Ouija board. It looked ancient, with faded letters and worn edges. I'd seen Ouija boards before, but this one felt different. There was a heaviness to it, like it carried a history that it shouldn't have. Next to the Ouija board was something that made my blood run cold. A doll, but not just any doll. It was a porcelain doll, the kind you might find in an antique store, with glassy eyes and a stiff lace dress. But what freaked me out was that it looked exactly like a doll my sister had when we were kids. A doll she had lost years ago and cried over for days. I hadn't thought about that doll in years, and seeing it now, in this box, made my skin crawl. I picked it up. my hands trembling. The doll's eyes seemed to follow me as I moved, and for a split second, I could have sworn they flickered. I shook my head, trying to dismiss it as my imagination running wild, but there was no denying how wrong this felt. I took the Ouija board and the doll out of the box and placed them on my coffee table. I was about to toss the box when I noticed something else at the bottom. A folded piece of paper. My heart skipped a beat as I unfolded it. Scrawled in messy handwriting were the words, "She's waiting." I stared at the note, my mind racing. Was this some kind of sick joke? Who would go through the trouble of finding a doll that looked exactly like the one my sister had lost? And what did the note mean? That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing faint noises in my apartment, creaks, whispers, things I could easily dismiss if I wasn't so on edge. But the worst part was the doll. I had left it on the coffee table, but when I woke up in the middle of the night, it was sitting on my dresser, staring at me. I'm a rational person. I don't believe in ghosts or curses, but something about this was seriously messing with my head. I told myself I must have moved it and just didn't remember, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The next morning, I decided to get rid of everything. The doll, the Ouija board, even the box. I tossed them in a dumpster a few blocks away, figuring that would be the end of it. But when I got back to my apartment, my heart sank. Sitting on the coffee table, right where I had left it the night before, was the doll. And that was just the beginning. I wish I could say I was one of those people who immediately bolted out of the apartment when they realized something was wrong. But I'm not. I'm the kind of person who overthinks everything, who tries to find a logical explanation for the most illogical situations. So when I saw the doll sitting back on my coffee table, I froze. My first thought was that I must have made a mistake. Maybe I didn't throw it out like I thought I did, but that wasn't possible. I remembered tossing it into that dumpster and hearing it hit the bottom, yet there it was, staring up at me with those cold, glassy eyes. I didn't know what else to do, so I called my sister. Even though it was early, I figured she'd want to know about the doll. I mean, it had to be some kind of sick prank, right? Maybe someone from our past was messing with me. As soon as she picked up, I launched into the whole story. How I ordered the mystery box, what was inside, and how I found the doll back on my coffee table. But her reaction wasn't what I expected. She didn't laugh or tell me I was being paranoid. Instead, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. When she finally spoke, her voice was shaky. "That doll, it was never lost, you know." Mum threw it out. I blinked, not sure I'd heard her right. What? Why would she do that? My sister sighed, and I could almost see her pinching the bridge of her nose like she always did when she was stressed. "You were too young to remember, but after I had that doll for a few months, weird things started happening around the house. I'd hear whispers at night, see shadows moving when no one else was around. Mum thought it was all in my head until the day I woke up with scratches all over my arms and legs. I felt a chill run down my spine. Scratches? From what? That's the thing, she continued. I didn't know. They weren't deep, but they were definitely there, like something had clawed at me in my sleep. Mum freaked out and threw the doll away the next day. I was devastated, but after that, everything went back to normal. I didn't realize until later that the doll was the cause of it all. Her words hung in the air between us, heavy and ominous. I didn't want to believe her. It sounded ridiculous, like something out of a bad horror movie, but there was a conviction in her voice that made it impossible to dismiss. My sister wasn't one to make up stories, especially not something like this. I tried to play it cool, but my voice came out shaky. So what am I supposed to do? I already tried getting rid of it, but it came back. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. You need to be careful. Don't antagonize it. Whatever you do, don't try to use that Ouija board. It's probably linked to the doll somehow. I thanked her and hung up, but her words kept echoing in my mind. Don't antagonize it. I didn't know how to handle this. Was I supposed to just live with the doll in my apartment, hoping it wouldn't scratch me up in my sleep like it did to my sister? I spent the rest of the day trying to ignore it, but every time I passed the coffee table, those glassy eyes seemed to follow me. By evening, I was a nervous wreck, jumping at every little noise. The worst part was the silence. My usually noisy apartment was eerily quiet, like something was holding its breath, waiting for me to make a move. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a blanket and crashed on the couch, hoping that maybe it was all in my head, that I'd wake up and everything would be back to normal. But as soon as I started to drift off, I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from the coffee table. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. The tapping continued, steady and insistent. It sounded like someone or something was lightly tapping its fingers against the wood. I slowly turned my head towards the table, and my blood ran cold. The doll's tiny porcelain hand was moving. It wasn't a big movement, just a slight flexing of the fingers, but it was enough to send me into full panic mode. I bolted off the couch and backed up against the wall, my eyes glued to the doll. The tapping stopped the second I moved, and the doll's hand fell limp again, like nothing had happened. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I knew I had to do something, but what? My sister's warning echoed in my mind. Don't antagonize it. But how was I supposed to live with this thing in my apartment? I needed help. But who do you call when a haunted doll is tapping its fingers on your coffee table at midnight? Finally, I grabbed my phone and started recording. I needed proof, something to show that I wasn't losing my mind. I hit record and slowly approached the doll, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone steady. I waited, staring at the doll through the screen, hoping and dreading that it would move again. But it didn't. It just sat there, lifeless, like any other doll. I waited for what felt like hours, but nothing happened. The tapping had stopped, and the apartment was dead silent again. I eventually turned off the recording, feeling a mix of relief and frustration. Maybe it really was all in my head. Maybe I was just stressed and tired, and my mind was playing tricks on me. But as I turned to head back to the couch, I felt a cold breeze pass by me. I froze, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. There were no windows open, no fans on, and yet the air around me felt cold, almost frigid. I turned back to the coffee table, and my heart stopped. The Ouija board was out of its box, lying flat on the table with the planchette resting on top. I hadn't touched it. I hadn't even gone near it. But there it was, like it had placed itself there, waiting for me. And then, as I stared in horror, the planchette slowly, almost casually, slid across the board, stopping on the letter H. I didn't wait to see what it would spell out next. I grabbed my keys and ran out of the apartment, not looking back. I needed to get out, to put some distance between me and whatever was happening in my home. But as I stood in the hallway, trying to calm my racing heart, I knew deep down that running wasn't going to help. Whatever I'd invited into my life with that mystery box, it wasn't going to let me go that easily. I spent the night at a friend's place. I told them I was having some plumbing issues and needed to crash on their couch. I wasn't ready to explain the real reason. I mean, how do you tell someone that a doll is haunting your apartment? They'd think I was crazy. I barely slept, tossing and turning, my mind replaying the image of that planchette moving on its own. The next morning, I knew I couldn't avoid going back to my apartment forever. I needed to figure out what was happening, but more importantly, how to make it stop. My sister's words kept ringing in my ears. Don't antagonize it. But what was I supposed to do? Just live with it? I returned to my apartment around noon, hoping that in the daylight, things wouldn't seem as terrifying. But as soon as I opened the door, I could tell something was off. The air inside was heavy, thick with an oppressive energy that made it hard to breathe. It was like walking into a room where someone had just been arguing, a tension you could almost feel on your skin. I forced myself to step inside, closing the door behind me. The living room was just as I'd left it, the Ouija board still on the coffee table, the doll sitting next to it, staring straight ahead. I avoided looking directly at them, my pulse quickening with every step I took deeper into the apartment. I needed to do something, but I didn't know where to start. I grabbed my laptop and began searching for anything that could help. Forums, articles, even old folklore about haunted dolls. Most of what I found was useless. People debating whether or not ghosts were real, or others trying to sell haunted items online. But then I stumbled across a post in a paranormal forum that caught my eye. It was from a woman who claimed to have experienced something similar, a doll that seemed to move on its own, strange noises at night, that same heavy feeling of being watched. She said she tried everything, burning sage, hiring a medium, even throwing the doll in the river, but nothing worked. In the end, she said, the only thing that gave her any peace was confronting it directly. She didn't give a lot of details, just a cryptic warning. It feeds on fear. If you want to stop it, you have to take away its power. Face it, but don't let it in. I didn't fully understand what she meant, but something about her words resonated with me. Maybe that was the answer. I had to face whatever this was, but I couldn't let it control me. I'd been running away, letting my fear take over, and that was only making things worse. With that thought in mind, I decided to try something that, in hindsight, was probably stupid. I grabbed the Ouija board and doll, taking them both into the bedroom. If I was going to confront this thing, I figured I should do it on my own terms. I didn't want it creeping up on me in the middle of the night again. I sat on the floor with the board in front of me and the doll propped up against the wall. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, but I forced myself to stay calm. This was my space, my home, and I wasn't going to let some stupid doll or board scare me out of it. I placed my hands on the planchette, half expecting it to start moving on its own. But nothing happened. The room was silent except for the sound of my own breathing. I took a deep breath and asked the first question that came to mind. "Who are you?" I waited, but the planchette didn't budge. The air felt thick around me, like the room was holding its breath. I tried again. "What do you want?" Still nothing. I was about to give up, thinking that maybe I was just being paranoid, when the planchette jerked beneath my fingers. I froze, watching as it slowly slid across the board, stopping on the letter Y. My hands started shaking, but I forced myself to stay still. The planchette moved again, spelling out the word "you." I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. My first instinct was to get up and leave, but I knew that wouldn't help. I had to see this through. I asked the next question, my voice barely a whisper. "Why me?" The planchette didn't move at first, but then it started spelling out another word. This time, it was slower, like whatever was controlling it was struggling to communicate. It spelled out, "Wait." My heart was in my throat. Wait for what? I wanted to ask. But before I could, the temperature in the room dropped sharply. It was like someone had opened a freezer door right next to me. I could see my breath misting in the air, and the light overhead started flickering. Then, I heard it. It was a faint, whispering sound. So quiet at first I thought I was imagining it, but as I strained to listen, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They weren't coming from the board, they were coming from the doll. The sound was like a distant, hushed conversation, words I couldn't quite make out, but the tone was unmistakable, malicious, angry. I stared at the doll, my mind racing. The whispers grew louder, filling the room, overlapping and swirling around me. It was like a chorus of voices, all speaking at once, none of them making any sense, but all of them filled with a cold, seething hatred. I couldn't take it anymore. I jumped up, knocking the Ouija board to the floor as I backed away. The whispers didn't stop. Instead, they seemed to intensify. Like whatever was inside that doll was getting angrier the more I resisted. My hands were shaking uncontrollably as I grabbed the doll and ran to the kitchen. I couldn't think straight. I just knew I had to get rid of it, now. I shoved the doll into a trash bag, tying it up tight, then ran outside and tossed it into the dumpster behind my building. I slammed the lid shut, panting, trying to calm the frantic beating of my heart. But as I stood there in the alley, I felt a cold breeze pass over me, and I heard it again, faint but unmistakable. The same whispering, coming from inside the dumpster. It didn't matter that the doll was wrapped up and thrown away. Whatever this was, it wasn't bound to just that object. I'd made a mistake. The whispering was in my head now, clawing its way into my mind, growing louder with each passing second. I turned and ran, back to my apartment, slamming the door behind me. The whispers followed me, relentless, even louder now that I was inside. It was as if they were taunting me, feeding off my fear, growing stronger the more terrified I became. I pressed my hands over my ears, trying to block it out, but the voices were inside me now, echoing in my mind, driving me to the edge. And then, as suddenly as they started, they stopped. Silence. Deafening, oppressive silence. I stood there trembling, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But nothing did. The apartment was still, the air heavy, but the voices were gone. Then, from the other room, I heard a slow, deliberate creaking sound, the kind of sound a door makes when it's being pushed open. I walked back into the living room, my legs weak, every step feeling like it might be my last. And there it was. The bedroom door was open, just a crack, and from the darkness beyond, I could see a single glassy eye staring back at me. The doll was back, sitting upright on my bed, its head slightly tilted as if it were watching me, and for the first time, I realized something I should have seen from the beginning. The doll's expression had changed. It was smiling. I stood there, frozen in place, staring at the doll on my bed. My mind couldn't process what I was seeing. It was the same doll, the one I had just thrown away, but now it was sitting there, grinning at me like it knew something I didn't. The shift in its expression was subtle but unmistakable. The corners of its porcelain mouth had curled up into a sickening, almost mocking smile. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to make sense of it all. This wasn't just a haunted object or some lingering spirit. Whatever was attached to that doll was intelligent. It was aware, and it was playing with me. I slowly backed out of the bedroom, not daring to take my eyes off the doll. I knew that if I looked away, something worse might happen, something I wasn't prepared to face. The apartment felt different now, darker, like the shadows had deepened and stretched out, filling every corner with an oppressive weight that made it hard to breathe. I reached the living room and grabbed my phone, desperate to find a way out of this nightmare. I was about to call my sister, but I hesitated. What could she do? She had warned me not to mess with the doll, and I hadn't listened. This was my fault, and I had to figure out how to stop it. The only person I could think of was the woman from the forum. She had faced something similar and survived, or at least she'd managed to make it stop. I scrolled through the forum post until I found her contact information, a throwaway email address. It was a long shot, but I had no other options. I quickly typed out a message, trying to convey the urgency of my situation without sounding completely insane. I hit send and waited, hoping for a quick response. But the minutes dragged by with no reply. The silence in the apartment was suffocating, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every creak, every shift in the shadows made me jump, my nerves fraying with each passing second. Finally, my phone buzzed with a new email. I nearly dropped it in my rush to open the message. It was from the woman, but her reply was short and direct. A far cry from the vague warnings in her forum post. You have to confront it directly. It's feeding on your fear. If you don't take control, it will consume you. Do not let it grow stronger. Face it now, or it will never leave you alone. Burn the doll, but be prepared for resistance. Burn the doll? The thought hadn't even crossed my mind. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. If this thing was attached to the doll, destroying it might be the only way to break whatever hold it had on me. But the idea of confronting it, of getting close enough to burn it, filled me with dread. I looked back toward the bedroom, where the door was still slightly ajar. The thought of going back in there, of touching that doll again, made my skin crawl, but I knew I didn't have a choice. The longer I waited, the stronger it would become. If I didn't act now, I might never get another chance. I searched through my apartment until I found a box of matches and an old lighter I'd forgotten I had. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold them, but I forced myself to keep going. I grabbed an empty metal wastebasket from under the sink, figuring it would be the safest way to contain the fire. With everything ready, I stood in front of the bedroom door, trying to summon the courage to go in. The air was thick with a palpable sense of wrongness, like I was standing on the edge of a precipice, about to dive into something I couldn't escape from. I took a deep breath, pushed the door open, and stepped inside. The doll hadn't moved. It was still sitting on the bed, smiling at me with that twisted, mocking expression. But the room felt different, colder, and the shadows seemed to pulse with a life of their own, as if they were watching, waiting to see what I would do. I walked slowly toward the bed, every instinct screaming at me to run. The closer I got, the more oppressive the air became, pressing down on me like a weight on my chest. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. When I reached the doll, I hesitated. Its glassy eyes stared up at me, and for a split second, I thought I saw something moving behind them, something dark and writhing, like a shadow trapped behind the porcelain. My stomach turned, and I nearly lost my nerve, but I couldn't back down now. I grabbed the doll, half expecting it to move or fight back, but it was as cold and lifeless as any other doll. I tossed it into the wastebasket and struck a match, holding it over the doll. The flame flickered in my trembling hand, casting long shadows across the room. For a moment, nothing happened. The doll just lay there, its smile seeming to mock me even more. But as the flame touched the fabric of its dress, the fire caught, quickly spreading across the doll's body. The smell of burning fabric filled the room, acrid and choking, but I didn't care. I just wanted it gone. But then, something strange happened. The fire should have consumed the doll quickly. It was just fabric and porcelain after all, but the flames seemed to struggle, like they were being pushed back by an invisible force. The shadows in the room grew darker, thicker, as if they were converging on the fire, trying to smother it. And then I heard it. A low, guttural growl vibrating through the air, coming from all around me. It wasn't a sound any human or animal could make. It was something primal, something ancient. The shadows seemed to pulse with the sound, shifting and writhing, closing in on me. Panic surged through me, but I knew I couldn't stop. I grabbed the lighter and held the flame to the doll, forcing the fire to spread. The growl grew louder, angrier, and I could feel the temperature in the room drop even further, like the air itself was turning to ice. The flames licked at the doll's face, and as the porcelain began to crack and blacken, the growl turned into a screech, a high-pitched, ear-splitting sound that made me drop the lighter and cover my ears. The shadows around me were moving now, swirling and twisting, like they were trying to escape the light of the fire. But I didn't stop. I grabbed the matches, lighting them all at once and throwing them into the wastebasket. The fire roared to life, and the screeching grew louder, more desperate, as the doll was consumed by flames. The shadows recoiled, shrinking back into the corners of the room, but I could still feel their presence, their anger. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The room was silent, the air heavy with the smell of smoke and burnt fabric. I stood there panting, my ears ringing from the noise, staring down at the charred remains of the doll. The porcelain had cracked and blackened, the dress reduced to ashes. Whatever presence had been in the room was gone, the oppressive weight lifted. But as I stared at the burnt remains, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over, that I hadn't truly defeated whatever this was. I grabbed the wastebasket and ran outside, dumping the remains into the dumpster just to be sure. As the ashes scattered in the breeze, I felt a small sense of relief, like I'd finally done something right. But the fear, the unease, still lingered. I went back inside, exhausted and shaken, and collapsed onto the couch. The apartment was quiet, peaceful even, but I couldn't relax. My mind was still racing, my heart pounding in my chest. And then, just as I was starting to calm down, I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from the coffee table. The Ouija board was back, and the planchette was moving, slowly, deliberately, spelling out a single word. Why? I stared at the Ouija board, my mind numb with disbelief. The word why glared up at me, the planchette resting on it as if waiting for my response. I couldn't comprehend how the board had returned, let alone how it had the nerve to question me after everything that had happened. I'd burned the doll, felt its presence retreat, but here it was, taunting me, challenging me as if to say, "You thought this was over." I didn't know what to do anymore. I was exhausted, physically and mentally drained, but there was no way I could ignore this. Whatever I was dealing with, it wasn't done with me. I knew that if I didn't face it now, it would continue to haunt me, maybe even escalate to something worse. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my trembling hands, and approached the coffee table. The air was thick with tension, and the room seemed darker than before, as if the shadows were inching closer, feeding off my fear. But I couldn't afford to be scared. Not now. I placed my hands on the planchette, half expecting it to jolt under my fingers, but it remained still, waiting. My pulse was racing, but I forced myself to focus. I had to ask the right questions, had to figure out what this thing wanted. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the planchette began to move. It dragged itself across the board, stopping on the letter P. It paused, then continued, spelling out the word pay. "Pay for what?" I demanded, my frustration boiling over. What did I do? The planchette moved again, faster this time, as if my anger had fueled it. It spelled out another word, life, and then paused, hovering over the board. I stared at the word, my mind racing. Life? What was it talking about? Whose life? I hadn't done anything to deserve this. I was just some idiot who ordered a mystery box from the deep web, thinking it would be a fun thrill. But then it hit me. Maybe it wasn't about me at all. Maybe it was about my sister, about the life she had before the doll was thrown out. "Is this about my sister?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Are you angry because she got rid of you?" The planchette didn't move, but the air in the room seemed to thicken, the shadows pulsing with a dark energy that made my skin crawl. I could feel something, a presence, gathering in the room, like a storm on the horizon, ready to break. "You were attached to her," I whispered, the realization dawning on me. "And when she got rid of you, you felt abandoned. That's why you're doing this, isn't it? You're angry because you lost your connection to her." The planchette moved again, slowly spelling out a single word. Yes, I felt a pang of sympathy, despite my fear. This entity, whatever it was, had been torn from the life it knew, cast aside like trash. But that didn't excuse what it had done to me, or what it was planning to do. "I'm not her," I said, my voice stronger now. "You can't punish me for what happened. It wasn't my fault. You're trying to take your anger out on me, but it won't bring you back to her." The planchette stopped moving, and for a moment, the room was silent. I held my breath, waiting, wondering if I'd somehow gotten through to it. But then the temperature dropped, and a deep, guttural growl echoed through the apartment. The shadows in the room coiled and twisted, like they were alive, writhing with fury. The board shook beneath my hands, the planchette moving on its own now, frantically spelling out a single word over and over. "Pay, pay, pay." The growling grew louder, filling my ears, drowning out everything else. The shadows swarmed around me, pressing in, suffocating me with their presence. I could feel them pulling at me, trying to drag me down into the darkness. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. My vision blurred, and I knew I was moments away from being consumed by whatever this was. But then, through the chaos, a thought broke through, a desperate, final attempt to reclaim control. "If you want to move on, you have to let go," I shouted, my voice trembling with both fear and determination. "I can't give you what you want, but you can choose to leave, to find peace instead of vengeance." The shadows hesitated, the growling subsiding into a low rumble. The planchette stopped its frantic movement, resting in the center of the board, as if considering my words. "Please," I whispered, every ounce of my will focused on this last plea. Let go. There's nothing for you here anymore. For what felt like an eternity, the room was still. The air crackled with tension, the shadows watching, waiting for the entity's next move. I didn't know if it would listen, if it even could, but I had to try. Then, slowly, the darkness began to recede. The oppressive weight lifted, and the air warmed, the growling fading into silence. The shadows retreated into the corners of the room, shrinking back as if the light had finally reached them. The planchette moved one last time, sliding across the board with a deliberate slowness. It stopped on the word goodbye. I exhaled a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. The atmosphere in the apartment lightened, the air no longer thick with malice. I watched as the board settled into stillness, the planchette resting on goodbye, like a final, silent farewell. I stood up, my legs weak and unsteady, and carefully placed the board back in the box. The doll was gone, its ashes scattered, and the presence that had haunted my home seemed to be gone with it. But I knew I couldn't stay there. Not after everything that had happened. I needed to leave, to start fresh somewhere else. As I packed a bag with essentials, I couldn't help but glance at the board one last time. The apartment was quiet, peaceful even, but there was a small part of me that couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't truly over, that maybe, somewhere out there, the entity still lingered, waiting for another opportunity to find what it had lost. But for now, the shadows were gone, and the whispers had fallen silent, and that was enough for me. I left the apartment, not looking back, and didn't stop walking until I was far from the building, from the street, from the life I'd known. I didn't know where I was going, but anywhere was better than where I'd been. As I disappeared into the night, the shadows in my mind slowly began to fade, leaving only the faint echo of a voice I hoped I would never hear again.